Thank you for coming in. So, okay, stay on that chat function. And before we get going on this presentation, I'd like to ask you this. You heard me say it a couple of times. You heard me say mobility on demand. You heard me say mobility as a service, or MOS. So as we sit and we talk, and John has heard me do this before, we've gotten into it a few times. Which is it? Is it mobility on demand, or is it mobility as a service? And which is the boss term, or are they different terms in your mind? And I'd love for you guys actually to weigh in that. So I'm typing you the question. Which is it? Which is the boss term? MOD or MOS? And if so, which one do you think it is? And describe for me what you think mobility on demand or mobility as a service is. And Sean's already weighing, excuse me, Scott's already weighing in. I got to put on my glasses so I can make sure I'm reading names properly. On demand means just that. It's just on demand. Service doesn't mean it's on demand. Oh, good. Interesting. So yes, which is it in you guys' mind as you sit and you think about this? And I'll get going on a presentation here in a minute, but I'd really love your thoughts about, as we think about this industry, and that's a question as well, but what is it? Is it MOD or MOS? And I've got you guys stumped as you're sitting here and thinking about that. We've got some human factors research, and Derek, I may ask you some questions a little bit later on about some of what you think in regards to human factors and behavior as we return from COVID and as we come back and respond. But and MOS, mobility as a service, suggests a transit vehicle in the chain. Tim McGuckin is a colleague of mine and we're working with on some work. He's with the Automated Vehicle Alliance. He's doing some work right now. And you can all see these answers, but I'm also recording some of this as well for the people on our phone who can't look at this, and also for the recording itself. You slot MOS as an umbrella over MOD. So mobility as a service over MOD, that the community shouldn't be debating the two terms. This is not productive. It doesn't advance our goals. I don't disagree with that, Tim. And actually, I think that they're complementary services, and we'll get into that. MOS is the integration. Thanks, Henry. And Sue, you think that something can be on demand or via, and MOS, it can be on demand, and it's neither. It's transit, says Derek. It's all about public transportation. And in fact, you know, when I've asked this question to others, that was actually one of the comments. You know, can't we just talk about this as public transportation, and how it's delivered perhaps is important, whether it be on demand or whether it be through different apps or the like. And you know, as we get going into this, and please do keep sort of weighing in as we go, but I'll start with my presentation here. And what we're going to do, Sarah and I, is we're going to chat just a little bit about mobility on demand, and I'm going to set the framework, if you will, of what's happening. But I want to also know that we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the COVID space, but I wanted to engage you guys in sort of thinking about this, because I think that you all are quite expert in your own ways as well. And I want to actually hear, as we continue to frame these discussions and we talk about it from a policy perspective and otherwise, I think it's critically important that we do have terminology right. And you'll hear me talk a little bit later about policy that's happening right now at the federal level, and being able to define what these things mean matters, because it actually attaches to funding and the like. And so so that's why I actually do pay attention to it, but I don't intend for it to be anything that divides how we think about transportation. But I think, Jesse, when you comment about MOS implying the replacement of owned vehicles so that you can have this flexibility in how you move around, I think that that's a really relevant way of looking at it. And when we talk about let me get out of this and the chat function for right now. When we talk about, let's see, you know what, hold on, I am not quite able to advance my slides. There we go, just a little slow. So when we talk about MOD and MOS, I like to start this by sort of framing sort of how we think a little bit about the services as a whole. And mobility on demand is certainly one of those things where it is about the on-demand service itself. And, you know, when we talk about it, it is a series of different kinds of modes, but I think that we recognize and understand that those on-demand providers are different today than they were 10 years ago. And that's facilitated, of course, by the advent of this as we get going and thinking about how do you put mobility at people's fingertips. Clearly, the integration with transit is a critical element to this. And as we move forward, we start thinking about how mobility as a service wraps around these tools and how do you create the leverage to incentivize travel and mobility that's seamless, that's equitable, that allows it easily at your fingertips, and how you put these things together. You know, when we talk about mobility on demand, though, I like to sort of weave in a broader thought process that really talks about the building blocks of how you think about what mobility on demand is. Mobility on demand, though, is ultimately about supply and demand. And when you think about supply and demand, it's about transportation as a commodity. And I think we've always thought about it in that way. But when we commoditized transportation back in the day, and when I think about it, you know, with my hat as a transportation, you know, the Colorado Department of Transportation, our commodity was a road. It was hard infrastructure that we built that facilitated movement. And that commodity itself was something that we thought about. We thought about our demand. We thought about the supply that was on that hard asset. Today, when we start thinking about transportation supply and demand, it's a much more seamless interaction in not just how we think about the hard assets, the physical assets that weave into this, but how we also think about the service side of it. But what are the supporting infrastructure behind all of this that allow for it to really effectively move? This transition that we've made to being a consumer-driven piece that allows for personal choice is something that was really facilitated and driven even more by the advent of private mobility service providers like our TNC partners, our scooter partners, and others. The fact that the data is really behind the scenes fueling this, whether it's delivering people or whether it's delivering cargo, and our management infrastructure behind the scenes to be able to manage this, and knowing that it is not just one mode. And I think that continues to grow and explode. And obviously COVID has impacted things, and we'll get into some of that. But I think it's important for us to understand that the silos that previously existed, I was with a DOT, I built a road, the cars and buses and other things went on, or I'm a transit agency and I manage a bus and or a train, that the interweaving of these facilities and these transportation silos is coming even more so in an on-demand world. And how you orchestrate that supply and demand is a critical piece to that. And I think that the interesting part that we've all seen in the last 10 years is, while all of these entities may have existed before, that the concepts behind on-demand mobility and the concepts behind creating seamless mobility through MOS platforms and others are breaking those pieces down and continuing to engage and pull all of them together. So when we talk about mobility service, I always show this slide, and I think it's fantastic from the Shared Use Mobility Center, a partner of ours that are working in these spaces, is to look at the explosion of what we would call on-demand mobility services. And I think that, and this is even old now, right? But I think that we all recognize that those dots weren't there 10 years ago. Many of those dots weren't there 3 years ago. And when we talk about scooters, and then many of those dots went away during COVID. And Sarah's going to get into that a little bit. And as we think about this, and we think about this new paradigm with how we think about transportation, the real question is do those dots continue to proliferate? Do they change? Do they evolve into different kinds of partnerships and the like? Is it still, as this frame was, very much a private sector dominated kind of process? Or do we look differently about what MOD 2.0 becomes as we move forward? So when I talk about building blocks, though, I think it's an important thing to see that mobility on demand, we often go straight to the mobility services pieces of this. And the mobility services side of all of this is understandably where people focus their most attention. And I think we all know, of course, over the last few years that in 2018, you know, the shared micromobility services and the trips that were taken nearly doubled from the year before. We know that over 40 million of those trips were assigned to one mode, which really didn't exist much 2 years before that, which was the scooter. And as we start thinking about these mobility services and how they weave together, I think that's the interesting piece that we continue to engage in and think about now. And as Sara gets going and talking about what we are seeing during the COVID side, I think the important part to understand is how all of these building blocks fit together and what we continue to sort of look at. which ones are staying, which ones are going, which ones are consolidating, how they're weaving in with different relationships with our private partners, with our public partners and others. And as we look at this as being part of our transportation ecosystem now, what it means to move it forward. I think we would be remiss if we weren't talking about mobility services, not just in terms of how it delivers people, but also how it delivers cargo. And the continual evolution of what we're seeing on the road, literally, when I talk about Amazon and we talk about partnerships that on-demand delivery with cargo delivery devices, whether they're using our bicycle lanes or our sidewalks, how we start thinking about drone delivery and frankly, UAS and what that means in this environment. How we think about the electrified future of on-demand mobility services, whether it be, looking at the electrification of our trucking fleet or our small delivery fleets, or even then on our micro-mobility side and or our micro-transit side. And then of course I have, future on-demand, but I think when you think about on-demand, we right now are thinking about something that is sort of very much an individual vehicle that is driven in some way that allows us to use it when we want it, how we want it. But when you look at concepts like Hyperloop and others, they too are very much designed, albeit within a tube, but to be an on-demand service that allows people to pick and choose which destination, how they get on and off, and the routing systems behind some of that very much fits within this on-demand facility. But the other piece that we talk about when we talk about the building blocks of mobility on demand is what it means to have infrastructure services on demand. How do we as entities, from our public entities to even the private sector partnerships, think about the assets that we have and how they feed into on-demand systems? And I think we've all been talking about this for a long time, but we need to be able to remind each other that how we think about our roadways on demand, our parking systems, our curbside and our drop-off and delivery, how we create mobility hubs that facilitate the movement between different modes that allow people to think about what kind of mobility services they look at, how we think about the data systems behind the scenes. And for those of you who are in the connected and automated space, how do things like connected V2X strategies, for instance, facilitate on-demand services? And I put that into the hard infrastructure because it's an important piece that we think about when we want to facilitate, for instance, safety of how we continue to move and how we think about the electrification of this space. And when we talk about infrastructure services, when we say infrastructure on demand, is how do we create flexible systems that allow the infrastructure to be used in a way that is matching the type of mobility movement and the mobility service that is happening today. And we know that that is a transitioning process, and one, again, that's facilitated by those management systems and the data behind the scenes. But what do we, as let's say, road operators or sidewalk operators, or even in partnership, how do we think about that? How do we think about our maintenance differently? How do we look at things? I'll use an example. When I was at a DOT, I'm thinking about road maintenance and my paving in a very certain way that facilitates movement for cars. How do I think about it when now I have scooters and more bikes on the road or on my sidewalks? What was a pothole to a car is very different to what is a pothole or a crack for a scooter rider. And how do I think about that in regards to safety and otherwise? So infrastructure services is a key building block when we think about this. Data services obviously fuel it all. And that is the true evolution of this. Data services fuel the customer interaction. They fuel the interaction of the vehicles and the availability of them. It fuels where we go. It fuels how we understand where people are moving. It fuels how we think about safety and how we facilitate that. And we recognize that it's dynamic. It has the capacity to be shared, and it is controversial. And when we talk about things like our mobility data specification, the MDS standards that are coming out of Los Angeles that are now now managed by our overall group, the Open Mobility Foundation. And we think about the intent of what is the partnership between our public and our private sector partners to be able to engage in a data sharing environment that facilitates the effective management of our right-of-way system, that also continues to preserve the business case, if you will, of our private mobility providers and how they leverage that data to continue to build their business. But ultimately underpinning that, how do we manage the consumer interaction of that and the protection of privacy and others, which is, again, one of the reasons, as you know, there is a lot of controversy around things like MDS. But the ACLU, for instance, just sued the city of Los Angeles in sort of the a warrantless collection of information and data from individuals is how they've described it. And so I think that we as an industry owe ourselves a very long and in-depth conversation about what effective data management really means and how we do that. And there are any number of different models as we think about that. And ultimately, who owns that data? You know, when we talk about the data, though, it really fuels this other building block of what we think of on-demand services, which is how do we operate our system? Because that is ultimately the intent of why we're gathering all of this. And so as we think about operator services, I often challenge us to think about that classic image that you see on the screen, which is a traffic operations center. What happens when I'm in an operations center and I'm gathering real-time information or near real-time information from our scooters, and my role and responsibility is to manage the distribution of those scooters and working with our private partner to ensure that there's scooter and mobility access in different neighborhoods, my community or otherwise. How do I, as a traffic operations center, now integrate that information with where my transit services are going or where my vehicles are going? And as we sit and we talk, the integration of all of that type of mobility isn't quite there yet. And so how do we think of that more effectively? How do we more effectively manage fleet management? How do we think, again, engaging in understanding where all of these vehicles are, if let's say fueled by a V2X environment, but also incorporating in other modes and on-demand modes that we know that we also have the capacity to engage in data sharing on, but what does that mean for an operations service? As we think about that, though, we know that understanding operations services is also a way of helping to improve behavior on our roadways. How do we think about improving the equity and the accessibility of the mobility systems to all of our communities? How do we think about pricing and payment in regards to how we integrate and create seamless mobility options? Clearly, when we talk about mobility as a service, the integrated payment and trip payment, both from a planning perspective to a payment perspective, is sort of the boss concept, if you will. That is where people are going. This is what they'd like to see as sort of the ultimate manifestation of mobility at everyone's fingertips. We know that we have some models of this happening in Europe, whether it be from WIM to UbiGo and others. But I think the important part to understand is, again, the partnerships that are behind the scenes that enable all of this, but then also how do we create different pricing models and the like, and this comes with our public policy intent and stuff that we've all talked about, that incentivizes certain behavior or that allows us to more effectively meet our overall public policy goals, whether it be equity, accessibility, sustainability, and green. And so how we manage these systems is critically important. It is growing rapidly, from our curbside management to our parking, to how we think about smart truck parking, how we think about electrification and pulling that in, and how you create that as a seamless experience. Clearly, as we move forward with elements like congestion pricing, road usage charge, or even data services that are all part of this utility, if you will, that we offer as part of transportation, I think that it's an important element for people to continue to think about how it fits in the public policy realm. And why do I put this in as a building block of mobility on demand? Because the pricing and the payment facilitates that on-demand capacity to really track transportation like a utility. I think, the fact is that we pay for what we use. And right now, we have an old model of how we pay for what we use in a mobility model. And clearly, on-demand services between scooters to TNCs and others has started changing the customer and the consumer interaction with how they think about transportation. You pay for what you use, and you understand the nature of that. It builds on what we've already been doing with toll operations and others, and it starts infusing mobility as more of an interaction, again, back to a commodity that is priced and used and supplied in an equitable way. So as we close this out, and I'm going to turn it to Sara to talk a little bit about what's happening in transportation and with COVID, the customer piece of this is critical. And we know that there is an integration system that allows us to think about how we move to sort of the epitome of what we think about mobility and mobility on demand and sort of MOS services. And I think as we move through all of this, the question of where we are in these levels and I ask you to look at this, and we'll ask some questions later as we get talking. But when you see these levels and you think then about in a post-COVID environment, where have we gone? Did we drop a level? Have we extended a level? Have the nature of what we're able to fund and that kind of thing, because of real issues now attached to dollars and commitments from our public entities and others because of the pressures of COVID, does this change how we continue to move in these levels for customer services? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sara Davidson, who is going to talk a little bit about what's happening during COVID, and we'll come back to you guys with some more questions.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Sara Davidson. As was mentioned earlier, I am a technical lead for smart systems at ITS America. And I want to talk to you guys briefly about the impact that COVID-19 has had on the mobility on demand ecosystem. And as I'm sure you guys have noticed in your own travel decision making, COVID-19 has had significant impacts on how, when, and how much people decide to travel. So initially, and to some degree in an ongoing sense, there has been changes to what we previously expected for MOD. So for example, there has been suspensions or eliminations of a number of services. For example, Uber and Lyft have temporarily suspended their shared or pooled rides, like Uber Pool and Lyft Line. Via also in certain areas got rid of its, temporarily suspended its shared ride services. Some micromobility programs were also suspended. For example, New York and Chicago and LA, in some cases, scooter shares were suspended, and in some cases, a number of bike share services were suspended, though not all of them, which we will talk about later. For those services that did continue, there was, in many cases, changes in demand. TNC service ride-hailing operators like Lyft and Uber saw notable decreases in ridership, and many micromobility service providers, such as scooters, also experienced lower levels of ridership. Some bike shares, however, such as those in New York, Philly, and Las Vegas, experienced spikes in ridership during this period, most likely because people are hesitant to use transit and other perhaps shared services that they might have been using in the past in order to follow social distancing guidelines and remain safe while getting to work at the same time. In New York City, for example, there was a year-over-year increase of 67% in the month of March for City Bike. And this is a chart just to show you how, in some cases, there was a real increase in MOD utilization. This is RTC's bike share program. And you can see that in the month of April, there was an enormous spike in ridership. Specifically, there was a 97% increase compared to April of last year. So during this COVID-19 period, there's been a real shift to essential mobility. People need access to transportation to get to healthcare needs, to the grocery store. We also have continued to need to transport essential workers, such as healthcare professionals and those who work in grocery stores and other individuals. And delivery has also seen an enormous uptick during this period. So the MOD ecosystem has shifted notably during this period to meet the evolving needs of their users. Some examples include that certain bike share programs, for example, have offered discounted or free rides or membership. Some of the ones that I list here are Capital Bike Share, which is in DC, or Indigo Bike Share, which is in Philly, as you can see in the photo on this slide. And some other bike shares such as Breeze, Mogo, and Ride KC offered free rides to members. During this period, a lot of people have been concerned about their job security, and there perhaps are associated financial concerns. So a lot of these programs are intended to make access to mobility more accessible for all during this, difficult time. A number of service providers have also come up with new services. For example, while Lyft Line, which is a cheaper option for those who want to share a ride and use a ride-hailing service, because that's temporarily been suspended to follow social distancing guidelines, Lyft launched their Wait and Save initiative, which allows individuals to wait a bit longer to get a more optimized ride, and it'll offer a cheaper fare. There's also an uptick in programs for essential workers. So this includes free and subsidized rides on TNCs, and also bike share and scooter services offered everything from free membership to free 30-minute rides, again, to help transport those who really need to keep moving in spite of stay-at-home orders over the past several months. There are also changes, for example, in-app notifications that would tell you how to be safe while traveling. So a lot of these MOD services really are trying to actively rethink and reimagine their business models as they move forward in this sort of new normal in the mobility ecosystem. So as Amy mentioned, there's been a real uptick in demand for delivery during this COVID-19 period. And MOD has sort of risen to the occasion in some cases to build partnerships with schools and grocery stores and other entities to try and help deliver essential supplies. This could be anything from the public schools in New Orleans partnered with Lyft to help make meal deliveries for low-income households, and to help with the delivery of laptops to facilitate distance learning. There's also been programs like, for example, Walmart has partnered with Uber and Lyft to help deliver groceries. So during this time where there's a shift in demand, there also might be new opportunities to leverage sort of the dynamic mobility that MOD services offer in order to more effectively and efficiently connect people with goods and services that they need in a way that is still safe during this period. This COVID-19 time also potentially opens new opportunities for some emerging technologies such as automated vehicles and drones. For instance, in Jacksonville, Florida, a partnership was launched transporting COVID-19 tests to a Mayo Clinic lab using an automated vehicle. And again, the appeal here is that it's a way to facilitate contactless delivery as we figure out what efforts are necessary to mitigate risks associated with spread of COVID-19. There are also a number of emerging services testing drone delivery, looking at how drones may be able to be leveraged as a tool for delivering medications, masks, hand sanitizer, particularly to elderly communities or remote locations. So as people start going back to some of the shared services, it's also important to look at how fleet management and safety protocol may need to evolve moving forward to increase rider confidence and promote public safety. So for example, the image here is Spin has come up with a range of disinfectant procedures showing workers how to clean the scooters, and also they are encouraging users to clean their vehicles prior to driving and as often as possible, and are attaching hand sanitizer to some of the scooters. There's new protocol for disinfecting bikes. Lyft also has sent drivers hand sanitizer and other cleaning supplies for free. So there's been a range of initiatives to help promote cleaning of shared vehicles. There have also been new requirements for PPE, protective equipment. For example, Lyft and Uber are requiring face masks to be worn during rides by drivers and passengers. And there have been additional safety considerations as well. For example, efforts to increase ventilation in shared vehicles, rear door entry, etc. So people are still, as we learn more about the disease, protocol and practices for MOD services are continuing to evolve. So moving forward, looking at how the role of MOD might change as we progress in this public health situation, but also emerging from it, hopefully in the near, hopefully, future. what is the role of MOD as a tool potentially to help fill gaps in transportation? During the COVID-19 sort of like lockdown, there were some cutbacks in bus service or after-hour transit service, and in some cases, mobility on-demand partnerships have helped to meet those needs. For example, Miami-Dade Transit in Florida partnered with Uber and Lyft to launch Go Nightly, a program that provides late night on-demand rides along fixed routes in place of an overnight bus service. These sort of partnerships also offer transit agencies that might be seeing some budget constraints. It offers them a way to continue providing service to users while being efficient with how they allocate their budget. So MOD can help potentially to provide coverage despite variable demand. Additionally, moving forward, there is likely to be a spike in some of the more socially distant mobility on-demand options. For example, scooter and bike shares, you're still traveling by yourself. It's possible to be 6 feet away from other individuals, so people might be more willing to use those modes, perhaps before utilizing a vehicle where they might be in close proximity to strangers. Also, we might see some additional shifts in how and when people are willing to leverage technologies like automated systems, drones, etc., for facilitating mobility. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about before turning this back over to Amy is how different areas are reimagining road and curb use during this time. So I'm sure you guys have noticed restaurant restrictions and policies vary state by state, but there have been notable increases in services offering pickup and delivery. So there have been programs changing the amount of dedicated curb space for pickup and drop-off options. This could also actually long-term make it easier for people to use TNC services by providing more accessible drop-off areas. Many cities are also adjusting parking regulations. For example, Montgomery County, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia have repurposed hourly street parking and no parking zones into curbside pickup zones. And finally, I know even where I live, there has been a change in how some roads are being used during this period. Near me on the weekends, there's a large road that is now being dedicated for pedestrian and multimodal travel. And across the United States, there's been various cities from Oakland to Denver to New York City that have closed select streets to vehicle traffic at specific times or in general in order to encourage walking, biking, and some of the other sort of more safe in this situation and also healthy transportation modes that don't mitigate, that don't contribute to congestion as well. We may see moving forward an increase in vehicle miles traveled and congestion as people perhaps turn to single occupancy vehicles, but leveraging MOD and shared vehicles may provide an opportunity to keep congestion a little under control in some cases, in some use cases, and also sort of rethinking how we use our roads to help promote social distance movement could also help continue to allow people to get to their destination while remaining safe. And so with that, I will turn this back to Amy.
So I was varying all my questions back to you, and I know this is unusual, but we'd love for questions from you guys as we go along. But here's my question to you. How does MOD come out of COVID? Does it come out stronger, or does it come out weakened in your mind? And when we talk about MOD, I mean now specifically the on-demand services that Sara was talking about. And I'm going to let you think and stew on that, and I'd love your opinion. And while you're doing that, here's my next question to you: is MOD now part of the transportation ecosystem? And I'm typing as we go. Or is it still a pilot? And the reason I ask that is because that's going to be the next part of my questions and discussion that I have out this. And so, Richard, you commented that you think it's weakened. And if I were engaging with you back and forth in person, type in why you think it's weakened in your mind. And you know, we obviously are on this presentation not talking a lot about transit, and deliberately so. But as we sit and we think about mobility on demand services and all of the changes that you saw that Sara talked about, provision of service to essential workers, partnerships with different transit agencies, simultaneous though to shutting down services and then layoffs in that cycle as well. It's how we think about this is an important thing. It's the less sharing of space. Yep. And here's someone else who also says that it's weakened because it's cost prohibitive, and especially if people have lost jobs. But you do think that it will be part of the ecosystem, and I appreciate that, Jim. I think that's an interesting piece of how we think about it, and that was a large part of the discussion as we were coming through COVID about whether on-demand mobility allowed for, let's say, through partnerships of transit, to be more responsive to the needs of trying to move people around in an era where grouping people on buses or the like maybe became something that people shied away from or may have a harder time returning to. And I'm not going to right now take the time to sort of predict on a lot of these things because I wouldn't mind sort of your thoughts on that as we continue in here. But yes, do let me know if you think if it's part of the ecosystem, if you think it will come out stronger or weaker. And then let me sort of add to this last part of our presentation, which talks a little bit about policy. So one of the pieces that we focus on at the MOD Alliance is very much about how we look at policy. And during the MOD cycle, during COVID relief, obviously we were funding transit in a pretty significant way to help them recover during this period. And the funding that came from the federal government, the $25 billion that came from the federal government, which was very much supported by ITS America and the Mobility on Demand Alliance, fueled the capacity for these transit agencies to be able to respond directly with cleaning, how they were supporting their staff, what they needed to do, and changing of their service routes and the like. But one of the things that it did not do was it did not fund, for instance, that partnership that Sara mentioned. That Miami-Dade, for instance, took all of their drivers, they surged them into the daytime so they could start running more buses and allow for the social distancing that was necessary on their buses. And the partnership that they did with Lyft and Uber, where they did vouchers to cover their nighttime services, was something that was paid for with local dollars. Or another example, that in the city of Detroit, they too were then doing on-demand service shuttles that would get essential workers to and from. And the way they paid for that was through foundation money. And so I think as we get into some of this, I think the important thing to understand is where is policy in looking at, is mobility on demand now part of really this transportation ecosystem, and how do we incorporate that in? And I'm going to speak directly now about the federal policy side of what this means. But as we do this, you know, we have a few of you sort of weighing in, and all of you can sort of see the comments, which I think are really interesting. So Henry, you actually comment that you think MOD will be stronger because the shift to socially distant mobility modes will remain. And I actually think that that's one of those pieces that might very well happen. I think the uptick on what Sara was talking about related to sort of the bike share ridership, our micromobility ridership, people feeling like that somehow is a safer, more public health responsible way of traveling and getting to modes is a really interesting way of looking at. I think, Tim, you noted that you think it will come out better because we're so much more aware of how we move. And on-demand services may be able to facilitate and to capture that kind of movement even better. I think there is a very real and very natural concern about the return to single occupant vehicles and the impact that that will have on our congestion and our air quality. And I know many are looking at that. One way that we can start talking about that is on the policy realm. And when we think about policy, one of the areas that we've been focused on is federal policy and what that means. What you have in front of you on the slide, and for those of you who are on the phone, I'll just sort of give a highlight, is how we make mobility on demand and mobility as a service eligible as part of federal funding. And we have some colleagues here on the phone who are very involved in the MOD sandbox and others that were coming from the FTA. that really show the promise of what on-demand mobility can be and what it can deliver with our transit agency partners and others. The interesting part now is that what you have in front of you just recently, coming out of the House with the INVEST Act and now being rolled into what's called the Moving Forward Infrastructure package that the Democrats are offering as part of the House, is that we've been working very hard on, is that mobility on demand and mobility as a service are now in these packages considered eligible formula funding, eligible for formula funding. And what that means is if you get funds for urban funding or for rural funding for transit services, that mobility on demand programs where you could create partnerships, let's say with Lyft and Uber to do nighttime service, similar to the way Miami did, or perhaps there's a partnership with a bike share, scooter share, and how you think about how you move people, or you continue to move into the MOS platform development. These are things that can more easily be funded now by federal dollars. With that comes some additional elements of data sharing frameworks and how you put these pieces together. So we go back, and since so many of us on the phone are in this connected and automated world and driven by data analysis and how we leverage data to more effectively manage our transportation system. So open data sharing is something that will actually be part potentially of a negotiated rules making to think more collectively about how we benefit both the private sector's intent on continuing to make a buck, and that sounds crass, but we know that is a very critical part to how we continue to fuel those mobility services, to how that intersects with the public sector's intent on effective management of our right-of-way systems. So as we talk about the policy, I think the other thing to understand too, as I come back to it, if I can back to my screen share, is understanding some of the rules and regulations and some of the definitions that fuel what is on-demand mobility. And these are some of the conversations that we're continuing to have, and I'd love to get your thoughts and questions about them, is how do rules and regulations such as things like Buy America or drug and alcohol testing or others impact our on-demand mobility partners, such as ride sourcing or our microtransit partners or our micromobility partners? How do we start thinking? And these are things that are dealt with at a very individual, local, and state level. How do you define the infrastructure usage? And a lot of folks have started getting into this, as we well know, across the states, legislatively and otherwise, about can bicycles and scooters be used on the road, or is it only on the sidewalk? What does it mean to really have, and I'll use terminology that some cities and others have adopted, the concept of lit lanes, where it's low impact transport or low individual transport facilities that really open up the definition now of how people are moving. It's not just about bicycles and pedestrians any longer. It is something that is broader than that. And going all the way back to that slide that I showed, it is even to the smaller robotic cargo delivery and the like, and how we think about what is on demand, and both from people and from a cargo perspective. The other things that we're continuing to think about from a policy perspective is how do you continue to extend this definition of what is mobility into programs like our commuter benefits, which are always tricky because it's taxes and it's the IRS, and tax policy is a really hard thing. But how do you go from not just creating commuter benefits that are beyond parking, which they have been, to the transit programs, which we've added, to individual bicycles, which has been really important. But how do you now consider on-demand mobility strategies such as bike share or scooter share, or even shared rides as part of these packages? And how do they fit within these mobility wallet concepts when you start moving forward with MOS services? And then ultimately, how do you count it? Because understanding that money flows right now based on how many rides you give. And when we start talking about how you engage and expand the concept of what is public transportation, and I'm going to go back to that definition that one of you offered to say, this isn't MOS or MOD, it's transit. And so how now do you expand the definition of how do we count what is transit, and what does that mean? And what does that mean for how we flow dollars? So as we think about MOD as we come out of the future, I think that the last question that I have for you all is this: is MOD here to stay? And you talk about whether it's strengthened or weakened, but is it here to stay? And then I'd love any questions that you guys might have about policy or data or otherwise here in our last few minutes. We've asked you a lot of questions and I've really enjoyed the conversation, but are there any questions that you have of us? And is MOD here to stay? That's my last question to you. And Sara, you said absolutely it's here to stay. And type back in why you think it's here to stay. And as you do that, I'm going to go back up because I think that we had a really interesting comment from Monsi that talked about the COVID situation. And it put the greenhouse gas emission question on the back burner because everyone is now focused on public health. And that's a really interesting piece to it now is how you think about what that means for private automobiles and how we look at this. And if I'm going to turn that into a question, I think the question is this, is how do we bundle some of the very adaptive changes that our on-demand mobility providers have done, our transit agencies have done, and yet resist the urge to go back to single occupant vehicles? When you look at what's happening in Asia and otherwise, there are a number of reasons why people are going back to transit. In fact, I think they're at 75% capacity right now. And the question, I think, with that is that you are seeing how people are doing contact tracing, how they are ensuring the public health, how they're looking at the social distancing. Tools now that we see very dynamically are on-demand providers looking at how can I do capacity management and actually reservation systems? How can we notify our users, again, back to that customer service side, about how full a bus is or how empty a bus is so I can get my ride and get reliably where I need to go. So all of these pieces are coming together. Sara, thanks for adding back that, you know, after you experience this pandemic, you think it changes the way about how we think about how we move, and that MOD makes you feel safe. And I think that that may be a big part of this. And as we talk with transit agencies, I think that transit agencies are very clearly looking right now at what it means to be a mobility integrator. And as you put the safe feeling into travel, what is their job now to create better mobility? And it may not be just to run our 40-foot buses, but how do we engage and adapt fleet that allow people to have enhanced mobility? Use the example of Cap Metro in Austin, and this has obviously been in the works for a while, but they are adopting and taking the bike share program and pulling it into their fleet. So that is part of transit now. And so I think that those are some of the interesting pieces that we have at play in how we think about mobility on demand and the potential. But Annie, thanks for joining in. And you, of course, know as much, if not more, about MOD than I. But here's your question, and I'm going to ask Sara to answer this. Do you think that COVID will have lasting impact on travel demand and patterns? And if so, what's the role for urban planners? And is the 15-minute city of Paris a good example? And I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to let Sara get into that first.
All right, well, thank you for your question, Annie. I think that what this COVID period has done is, you know, there's already been an increased interest in personalized and demand responsive ways to leverage new mobility services and technologies. What I think we've had to do during COVID-19 is all of a sudden it's forcing people to really fundamentally rethink how they move and their travel decisions. And I think a lot of transit providers are having to rethink how they offer their service as well. So I think this period, there's more incentive for people to make sudden changes now to, you know, is my service cost efficient? Would there be other ways to provide service to individuals while saving costs? And mobility on demand does offer, as you know, and many others in the industry are aware, it does in some cases offer ways to more dynamically respond to need. In terms of the role of urban planners, though my background isn't in urban planning, it's in mathematics, I do think this is an important time for city planners and those who study the way we use roads to rethink, you know, what is really important to getting people from point A to point B, and what can be done to make sure that our networks remain efficient in the way they operate so that they're not marred by congestion, and so that people feel they can travel with confidence. There are a lot of different international examples of sort of reimagining how we're using our roads and our curbs, and I think I certainly hope the US is taking notes on that. It's also possible that a different mix of MOD options might be a better fit in some areas than in others. So I think it's really important for local government and transit agencies, et cetera, to work with the mobility service providers to see what is the best fit for their area and what might be an effective way to help their citizens and travel.
You know, I'll just sort of add to that, and I'm going to do one thing with the whole group. I'm going to plug an effort that Annie is leading right now that will have national implications in our mobility data consortium, as we talked about mobility data being a really critical piece to what fuels the supply and demand elements of what mobility on demand is. And putting together a very effective SAE is leading a standards development process for mobility on demand. And I urge you all, and we're going to probably have them join us and talking about some of those efforts, but it's a critical piece to how we continue to make this something that moves forward. A lot of you have responded directly to me, and I'm just going to sort of capture some of these last thoughts. That absolutely it's here to say this question could have been asked of ITS 30 years ago, and here it is, and that we'll continue to move forward. And someone adding that it's allowed us, and COVID has allowed us to be more, to think more about our actions and what the impact it has on others, and that mobility is a piece to that and how we are impactful in the type of mobility we go. But to close it, Annie, I'm going to come back to your comment because I actually do think that the capacity to rethink how our travel has been is one that is relevant. I know myself very much stayed within my 15-minute cycle here within my community. And I would expand it to sort of say a 20-minute transit village, if you will, not just from a walking and an active transportation, but how does on-demand mobility help facilitate that type of movement? And how do I, for instance, if I am a transit agency, continue to reimagine how I provide services from those that are the very active high capacity transportation lines and transit lines to engage with almost these 20-minute transit or mobility villages that allow people to move where they need to go. And what does my fleet and what does my engagement look like when it puts that together? And I think that we owe it to ourselves, and many transit agencies and others have the capacity right now to take the opportunity of COVID because of, very frankly, the very serious budget issues that many are going to find themselves in. I'll use Denver, which is where I am, with a $250 million funding gap for next year. How you reimagine what transit and what mobility really looks like. And so as we close this out, and I want to make sure that I kept us all on time for our lunch and learn, I just wanted to say thanks for weighing in, because your thoughts and comments really help us think too with the On Demand Alliance and Mobility On Demand Alliance, and how we continue to further this conversation. And you see on the screen some of the areas that we're working very actively in, and whether it be from policy to different partnerships where we talk about issues that you know are different and unique, or how we think about things like insurance, or you know how I help spread the word, for instance, on the work that Annie is doing with SAE. But then how we also understand what the public and practitioners think about this space, their awareness of it, what their interactions are, the policies and the adoptions and the understandings are there. So research that we do. And so engaging with folks like you, engaging with groups like yours, Debbie, which, you know, how could we potentially partner and continue looking at advancing our research, our partnerships with connected vehicles and V2X. I think all of these are elements that we should continue to be focusing on. And I say this because the group is so robust and so talented as I look at what you all are doing, that if there are some opportunities for us to think about how we work together in these kinds of spaces, I'd love to continue to explore them, and how we continue to lift this industry such that and this mode of mobility and this engagement of how we provide seamless mobility to everyone, and how we truly do continue to embed it in the ecosystem. But then also it is about that goal of keeping everyone moving, keeping them safe while we do that, and making sure that that it helps fuel our economy and fuel people's quality of life. So thanks so much for the time that we've spent here with you guys today.
Well, Amy, Sara, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us today for this special Lunch and Learn webinar. We'll hope you'll join us on Tuesday, July 28th for our next research review with Doctors Robin Brewer and Nicole Ellison, professors in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. They'll be discussing their recently completed research project, Supporting People with Vision Impairments and AVs. Registration is now live at ccatvision.eventbrite.com, and the link can be found in the chat portion of the Zoom, along with the sign up for our mailing list if you are not already part of it. If you miss any portion of today's webinar, the entire presentation will be live on our YouTube channel this Friday at youtube.com/Center for Connected and Automated Transportation. Thank you, everybody.